Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we explore the strengths we have because of our sensitivity and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there. To the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers, welcome. I'm really glad you're here today. We are mid-January of the year 2022. How's it going? Who would have thought 2 years ago that this is where we'd be now? How is your stress level? How are you managing? How is your hypervigilance? How is your new year? And if it's great, that's great. And if you're having a hard time, that's okay too. We've been doing this stuff for a really long time, and every time we expect it to get better, we get another little surprise. Let me tell you a little bit about today's episode. If you listen to episode 120 with Jen Perry called Social Anxiety and Confidence in the Highly Sensitive Person, I had said that Jen and I recorded a part 1 and we lost it. Well, we were able to recover it. So this is part 1 to the episode that you heard already. And these are questions that I got from a listener, Tosh from Wellington. In this episode, some of the questions that Tosh asks are, Tosh says that with her high sensitivity and social anxiety, it makes it really hard to talk to people unless she's known them for a very long time. She talks about feeling anxious and not being able to communicate her thoughts clearly, being misinterpreted, or losing her train of thought, and her anxiety causes these things to happen more, which impacts her confidence. She also talks about no matter how comfortable she is, it's really difficult for her to talk about her own experiences, thoughts, or feelings. My guess is some of you are going, oh my gosh, that sounds just like me. So these are some of the things that Jen and I talk about on this episode. If you listen to episode 120, that was our second recording, and Jen encouraged me to loosen up a little bit and not be so tasky. And we kind of just had a really nice little chit chat in the beginning. My taskmaster can really take over, and I just want to get to the meat of things. If you are comfortable giving me some feedback, either in the closed Facebook group, Unapologetically Sensitive, if you're a member, or you can ask to join, or if you want to shoot me an email at unapologeticallysensitive@gmail.com, I'm curious to know, are you like tasky? Do you just prefer that we get down to business, or do you enjoy the genuine, authentic conversation that we have? Just curious to know. I think that's it. And now, on to the show. Hey, Jen, welcome.
Hi, Patricia. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm excited to have you here today. So I'm just going to have you start with this listener letter, and then I'm going to read part of her question, and then we're going to talk about it. So go.
Okay, I love this first part. This is from Tosh from Wellington, New Zealand, who says, by the way, I'm so grateful to have found your podcast. Thank you for being yourself so authentically and sharing your inner workings with us. Every time I listen, I feel encouraged, affirmed, and a little bit wiser. Thank you, Patricia.
All right. So then she goes on to ask, something I really struggle with that may be related to my high sensitivity is social anxiety. I find it so hard to talk to people unless I've known them for a very long time, but I desperately want to make meaningful connections with new people. When I'm with people who don't know me well, I'm so anxious about not being able to communicate my thoughts clearly, being misinterpreted, or losing my train of thought that my anxiety causes these things to happen more, which knocks my confidence even further.
That is a difficult part of social anxiety, and I think compounded, right, by being at HSP. I guess one thing I'd want to speak to with that is just the reminder that your nervous system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. So we all live with this wild animal inside of us, this fight or flight. I think Brene Brown puts it really well. She talks about how we are wired for belonging. What that means is that it really does register in our fight or flight how we are doing in a social context, because when our brains were being formed in evolution, right, we're with small hunter-gatherer groups. If you got kicked out that night and you weren't sure of your social standing, you were dead. You were left out away from the fire. right? Away from food, away from shelter, and probably eaten by a wild animal that night. When we approach working with ourselves from this perspective that there's nothing wrong with us, we just have this really intense nervous system and it needs us to take care of it. So as you would like a frightened child, or, if you've ever tamed a rescue animal or something, right? You really have to work with yourself in that deep breathing, reminding yourself, this is not that. We don't live under those circumstances anymore. You bomb a social interaction these days, you're fine. You go home and you have other people in your life. So I like to remember that when social anxiety overlaps with HSP, that there's really nothing wrong with you at all. You're just doing what your brain was designed to do. And it just needs that prefrontal cortex to come online and to work with yourself that way.
The next part of her question is, another thing I've noticed, and this occurs no matter how comfortable I am with my conversation partner, is that it's very difficult for me to talk about my own experiences, thoughts, or feelings, even when I have a strong desire to share them. I wonder if it's partly because feeling strong emotions seems to interfere with my ability to turn thoughts into words.
Oh boy, I feel that one too. Yes. I would say one thing that might help is for you to slow everything down. Perhaps there is someone in your life that you can use as a practice partner, not unlike what Patricia and I do with our Marco Polo, right? Which is to talk about our experiences asynchronistically, and we pause and let the emotions swell. Be patient, slow everything down, feel the emotion fully, like a wave that's coming up. Let it kind of crash, let it recede, breathe, take care of yourself. And I promise you, this does get easier. It's a practice. If we could really honor our emotions instead of what I suspect, I'm trying to tell a story and I'm feeling all of this emotion. I don't want to feel the emotion, so I'm going to try and bottle that up a bit, which kind of like standing on a garden hose, it just pressurizes it and makes it even harder. And now instead of, focusing on your story, you're trying to keep your emotions in check. And so, of course, it's going to interfere with your ability to tell a story. I would say, is there a way that you can practice honoring yourself, your emotions, your experience, and almost like stop trying for the moment and trust that you will be able to pick up the thread as soon as that emotion subsides. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. One of the things that I often talk with clients about, that they'll be in a situation and they leave it and they wanted to say something and they didn't know how to respond. Somebody said something. And so we practice, or we talk about, what is it that you would have liked to have said? And sometimes this is when people give digs. This is a little bit different, but I think it's still relatable, that somebody will say something like, you always think so much, or you have to take things, to such a deep level. We talk about, what is it that you would have liked to have said? And we process that, because then it ends up building this repertoire of things that you can say. And with a specific client that I'm thinking about, as we've met over time, this client will say, I had this interaction and I said this thing. And the client's really surprised and shocked that they had something to say in the moment, because they tend to need lots of time to process, and in the moment tend to not be able to respond the way that they want to. So another way that I think we build up that muscle is talking about the things we're passionate about, talking about the ways that we would like to respond with somebody that's safe outside of that social situation when that arousal level is not so high. And that kind of puts it into, I don't know if muscle memory is the right word, but it creates a repertoire of things that they can pull on when they are having conversations and they've kind of practiced, like you'd practice the piano, so that if you have a performance, you've practiced so much that your body knows what it's supposed to do. I mean, do you have any thoughts about that, Jen?
No, that sounds like definitely, I am laughing over here because I can relate to having that. Oh, I should have said this. And it's usually at like 3 a.m. or something. So, if it's a story about, if it's a retort or it's something, it's always good to have something in your back pocket that you've rehearsed. I was also thinking that for our stories, the ones that we know well and the ones that we want to share, it's okay to journal about it, right, it's okay to have someone that you trust, just even bring them along. Say, I have this difficulty when I'm trying to discuss something and I just shut down. I was wondering if if you could help me out with this. If you can get that trusted person to help you, and that muscle memory, Patricia's like spot on about that. It'll be easier the more you practice. And then the other thing that I just wanted to say is that, not everybody deserves to hear our stories. And so if you're really not feeling a relational safety, just to really notice that. And that's really okay. Our stories are not for everybody. And it's good information. And maybe that person just really isn't your person.
Yeah. I've had to tell myself a new narrative because my narrative tends to be I'm too much or, I overshare. And I'm doing things with this new group. And it's really been an interesting process to see all of my old history that comes up about how much I feel like I fit in or I don't. And one day I was sharing about something that happened with my son. It's a very intimate story. And as soon as I shared it, somebody changed the subject. And so I obviously went into this like, it was too much. I overshared. I think it's a beautiful story of the closeness and the trust that we have in our relationship, but not everybody's ready to hear that. And so it's been challenging to try and figure out what the group norms are. How can I show up and not going into a negative narrative? And I've had to tell myself it's okay for me to show up exactly as I am. People are lucky to get to know me. I share in a very different way that most people do. So if you do have those shame attacks that come up in the moment or after the fact, that part of our job is to do that healing, is to change that old narrative of like, you overshared, or how could you have said that, or whatever our stuff is, to create a new narrative. Otherwise, we kind of keep our thumb on our heads and push ourselves back into that box. It keeps us in that socially anxious, awkward place.
Definitely. I guess just to add one more thing with that too, that I want to point out to Tosh and to any of the listeners that are resonating with this conversation, is that we all have that edge. Like as you practice and you get pretty good at, different layers of your experience, we all have the tender place inside of us where it gets difficult. And that in and of itself is really beautiful information and an invitation to be really gentle with yourself. So, even as I'm up here talking about this stuff, because it's my passion and I'm a geek and I study it and I'm an HSP myself and I see clients and all that. And I've gotten pretty good. I've practiced it. I've had a lot of the similar experiences in childhood that all of us HSPs have. But I want to put out there that as easy as it's gotten now with practice, with some stories, that I still have that like tender area when I've uncovered something with myself, or, lately it's been just some real insecurities that have been creeping up on me. And I will need to take that breath, honor the emotions that come up as, just a sacred part of me, and not necessarily share that with everybody. We all have that. I just don't want to give the impression that it's like something you get and then you've got it. It's just these layers of practice.
Yeah. I'm wondering too if it would be helpful to do a check-in before a conversation about how aroused you are. Because like Jen said, that if you're in that fight or flight, if your heart is beating or you're having tightness in your chest or your stomach's hurting or you're having head pressure, whatever goes on for you when you're anxious, we want to get you calmed down and back, like Jen said, into your frontal lobe. So that would mean doing some breathing or some exercises or, some mindfulness, or looking around the room and doing some grounding about what do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? Because if you're in that fight or flight where you're really overly aroused, then there's a good chance that your frontal lobe, your thinking brain, has gone offline, and it is going to make it harder for you because you're out of that optimal zone of arousal. So being mindful before you go into a conversation about, can you get yourself into a grounded space, and do you know what that is, and do you know how to do that?
Absolutely. And just another thing along with that, you could also ask your conversation partner how they're doing, and if they have the bandwidth in that moment to make some space for you. Because, if you catch them at the wrong time, maybe they're busy, have a lot going on, or, my brain goes to scrambled eggs when I got too much going on. But if I get that heads up, then from someone that they really need my attention in a tender way, that can be really, really helpful to set the conversation up.
Yeah. Okay, another part of Tasha's question is, I often have so much going on in my mind, I struggle to believe people would have the patience or desire to bear with me if I attempted to make sense of it all out loud. So I usually don't even try.
That sounds like a bit of that I'm too much belief coming up. It's that word trust, right? Having self-trust that you're okay the way you are, and to honor your stories and honor your emotions. And then also to trust others. And Tosh, I feel you. I mentioned earlier a little bit of that insecurity that I've been having lately. And when you said that, I struggle to believe people would have the patience or desire to bear with me. I just want to hold that really tenderly. That I'm too much. Is it okay to be me? And can I trust the other person? So it's important to take that breath, maybe look at where that comes from, and realize that may not be like what's right in front of you. So from my own life, with these insecurities that are coming up, and I'm sharing them with my partner, and I know it has nothing to do with her. And if I can kind of own that, it really makes it a lot easier. And so all the layers of our conversation today, right, is this someone you trust? Because if it really is, and there's relational safety there, you are hitting a bit of that tender owie that I call it, that a lot of us have. It's a very common core human belief. I know that for myself, it comes from maybe being young and not having adults around me that would be able to make that space and that patience and have that patience for me. So, those are like really deeply ingrained patterns that we need to hold tenderly, test out against reality, right? And be really patient with ourselves. And it's funny because I'll feel like I got somewhere with it. And then a couple of years later, it's like, oh my God, it's here again. It is just, I call it a tripwire. And I guess I'd invite you to just really make some space to be with it, with compassion for yourself, and a lot of curiosity.
Yeah, it's not uncommon too that I'm wondering if you go back and think on your family of origin growing up, schools, relationships. Did you hear things like, you take so long, or, how come you're so slow to process, or you ramble, or get to the point? My guess is that you receive some of these messages because we all have them, and then we internalize them, and then we shame ourselves. And it's interesting that when Jen and I got on to record today, I get in my tasky brain, and my tasky brain is incredibly unempathic, and I don't want to make chit chat. And I told Jen that, and we had these questions that we were getting ready to read. And when we were talking about, well, which paragraph is who going to read? I'd cut out the first part where Tosh had talked about, thanks for the podcast, because it's not relevant. We have to get to the point. Like my tasky part was on. And Jen said, this is really important to read. And the reason why I'm sharing this with you is, that wound of too much or not enough shows up for us, and this is how it manifests. And so it's about loving and embracing all the parts that we have and recognizing those wounds that we receive from other people. We often continue to give them to ourselves. And so when we have people around us like Jen that said, this is relevant, I'm like, okay. It's an ongoing work in process for all of us. And like Jen said, it's not that we hit some place where we're like, okay, I'm done growing. I've achieved it. It's just an ongoing process.
I'm so glad you read it.
You read it.
Oh, that's right. I read it. I'm so glad you let me read it, because it's important. And that I think is that honoring, right? That self-honoring. So
right.
Yeah, I join with everybody else thanking you for your love and attention and the gift of your vulnerability in this podcast.
Oh, well, thanks. So I'm struggling. We have 2 more questions left, and I'm trying to decide if we should just stretch this out a little bit and save those 2 questions for a part 2. I think we should do that. What do you think?
I am game for a part 2. Yes.
Okay.
I think there was a lot in this question for us to unpack.
So in retrospect, is there anything else that you want to say about this topic, Jen, before we wrap up?
I guess a couple of things that I didn't really get to say in there was, well, I said it a little bit, the idea about self-trust and to really honor your own story, your own hero's journey, wherever you are in that arc. And also just reiterate again that communication's a two-way street. If it doesn't land, it really is a cooperative effort. And to be careful not to take all of that on yourself. Communication's also a skill. Miscommunication is rampant. So I just want to really validate Tasha's concerns. I want to validate that that's a very real thing. And just remember that it is two ways. And, sometimes as much as we want someone to be our person and to be able to make space for that, they can't. And that's not on us. And to really remember that.
Yeah. And maybe just in closing to think, are there any people that you do feel comfortable with or at ease? And what is it about those relationships that make you have that sense of like, this is safe and this is home? And maybe do some comparing and contrasting in the relationships where you're not feeling that. It may be that the other person isn't safe, or that your communication styles are different, or there's somebody who has their tasky brain on and wants you to get to the point and is not able to shift into that place of just holding space for you. So we often tend to think that there's something wrong with us. And if you can pull back and maybe look at what the bigger picture is, that also may be helpful.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. I think that's all we have for this episode. Is there anything else, Jen, before we wrap up?
No, thank you. It's a pleasure as always.
All right. We are going to end this. We will talk to you later. Thanks for being here today, Jen. Bye. Hey again. I'm curious to know what you thought. I love how Jen and I have very different approaches to things. I think it really makes a nice balance. And my hope is that as you, the listener, it's nice to hear kind of a multifaceted approach to listener questions. So thank you. If you heard things that you relate to, if these are things that you're struggling with all of the things that are going on in the world right now and this resurgence of COVID and the new variant of Omicron, a lot of people are really struggling with their mental health and well-being. It's just a hard time. It's not my intention to be negative or to bring you down. I'm just naming what I'm seeing going on in the world. If you are needing extra support, Jen and I are both trained therapists. We also do coaching. If you like what you hear from either one of us and you feel like you want to get some support, please feel free to reach out to us. You can reach Jen at heartfulnessconsulting.com. And you can reach out to me at unapologeticallysensitive.com. We both are here to support you. We want you to thrive as a highly sensitive person. It's a little hard right now, and it's okay to need that extra support. I hope you are doing well. Thank you so much for being here today. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.